All the drawings that my tutors told me were shit got me hired by Disney.
Hello and welcome back to the Animator Guild podcast, the ideal podcast to play during your in-betweens. For this episode, I invited Fraser Maclean. Fraser Maclean started work in film as a live-action film editor and began his career with animation with his work on Who Framed Roger Rabbit 1988. He has worked for Passion Pictures, Cambridge Animation Systems, Teleimagination and Disney on such films as Space Jam and Disney's Tarzan. I first found out about Fraser when I bought his book, Setting the Scene, a book which has become a bit of a collector's item since it went out of print. This quintessential book on animation layout positions Fraser as one of the best curators, historians and teachers of Western animation history. In this discussion, we traverse a range of animation topics from animation education to history, politics, technology, collaboration, and career advice. I decided to break our conversation up into two parts. This is part one. I hope you get as much out of this as I did recording it. Fraser's language is a bit colourful at times, so if you are playing this through a speaker around young kids, you have been warned. Please enjoy my discussion with Fraser Maclean. Welcome to the podcast, and thank you so much for giving your time today.
Thank you for the invitation. I'm only too happy to talk about all of this with somebody who's such an enthusiast and such a champion for the medium. So yeah, it's thanks for asking me on.
I mean, there's a lot of things that I kind of like to talk to you about today, and some of it for the benefit of other students that might be listening to this. They're people who are like me a few years ago. They're going through the education system in animation, and you're someone who has quite a lot of opinions on the animation education system, especially in the West. And you actually mentioned to me at one point that there's a bias in animation education towards creativity.
There is.
The creative aspects, but not towards the logistical aspects, which is where we have these deficits in producers.
Yeah, because it's a customer-based system. It's a numbers-based system. This might be pushing it, and I again, it may just be a kind of semantic argument, but most of what I share in terms of information about where the education system could be doing a better job is not opinion. It's observation. I've been doing this for 20 years. I've been in there asking these questions, raising these issues, and being given reasons repeatedly why we can't do this, we can't do that, we're not going to change this. So it's not a question of me thinking, oh, well, this is orange, blue, or green, or whatever, or a matter of taste. It's simple reporting of fact, because very often that's a way of diluting the importance of these things, is just to say, well, that's Fraser's opinion. It's not. It's Fraser's experience of teaching in the United Kingdom, Austria, Lebanon, where, it doesn't matter where you go, a university is a university. And in the 1970s, so I was a student in Scotland from 1978 until 1983. So 1978 to 79, I was a university student. So I know what universities used to be and how they used to operate. Okay, I only had 1 year's experience, and I was from when I was 17 to when I was 18, but I was studying the history of art, archaeology and Italian. I did it for a year before I got accepted into art college. And my government paid for me to study. And that was a system that worked perfectly okay. But all around the world, the decision was made by lots of different countries, no, we are going to charge people for education. So education immediately, by that mechanism, becomes a privilege and not a right at that level. It's a simple matter of fact. It's not Fraser's opinion. That's how it works. Now, another thing that crept in was that the universities became part of a mechanism to camouflage unemployment statistics. So by the time Blair and Brown were in office as a Labour government, they were saying, we want to get 50% of school leavers. Go check the records. They said this in public. They want to get 50% of school leavers into a university. which is like saying you want to get 50% of the population into a hospital. You go to a hospital when you need to go to a hospital.
Yeah, yeah.
You go to a university when you want to study or you want to acquire knowledge or skill. but they were herding people into universities to avoid letting them register as an unemployment statistic, because while you're studying, you don't appear on the page of the economic, the ledger that says that you don't have work. It's like, oh no, that person's studying. They'll work eventually. So it's a great way of making unemployment figures go away from the age of leaving high school to the age of leaving university. Only once you qualify do you become a member of the workforce, and you are either employed or unemployed. And it works like a charm.
Yeah.
The problem is that it encourages a disparity between students studying particular subjects and the actual market demand for those skills. So the other thing that you have to do if you want to do that and not have any questions about your motivation is you have to choose subjects that are not regulated by law. Now, you can't play the numbers game with medicine, because people are like, oh, that's a matter of life and death. And of course, animation is a trivial thing to do with the entertainment industry, which is also simply not true. But you can't teach engineering, you can't teach architecture. There are lots of subjects that are regulated by law. Nothing in the entertainment or communication sector is, that I'm aware of. I mean, there may be still a few tiny functioning regulations governing freedom of the press, but if you look at what's happening in the Murdoch empire, you can have all kinds of presentations of information without fact-checking, without all that kind of stuff. But now, in the field of animation, games, visual effects, yes, there are industry bodies like Skillset that have made attempts to regulate and to say, okay, well, we will give accreditation to this course over that course. But the reason that the creative skills are so favored or emphasized is, well, everybody wants to be creative. Everybody wants to be a director. Everybody wants to be a screenwriter. And it was put in very, very clear terms to somebody who was actually in charge of one of these courses in Scotland. And I was making all of my usual arguments as somebody who has worked in the industry in Europe, in the United States. I do know what I'm talking about. I'm not making this up.
Absolutely.
And he sat there, never having made a film in his entire life, and said, well, of course, Fraser, I agree with 95% of what you're saying, but what you're describing is training the worker bees of the industry. And I was like, I'm sorry, how does honey get made? Are you suggesting that the universities only teach the queen bees and you'll sit in the canvas chair with the director's name on the background? Bullshit. The other aspect of it that is clearer in my mind now than ever before is that the academic approach to teaching skills, if you're going to study English literature or chemistry or forensics or whatever, is the particular achievements and capabilities of one person. And those are graded and marked, and then you get a qualification. Big front page news. Individuals don't make movies. Teams make movies. And we don't have an issue with this if it's sport. If you've got a young person who's got sporting ability, say it's football, if you've got a daughter or a son that wants to play football, soccer, they get a coach, they join a team, they go out and compete. If your child is talented musically, they get an instrumental instructor, they join an orchestra, they go out and perform. If you have any visual art capability whatsoever, stay on your own, in your bedroom, and hope you get famous, or get an online following, or whatever. And we are not training teams of people the way that teams of people actually make a feature film or a television episode or a video game. We are using a totally inappropriate model. And 20, 30 years ago, we would have had an alternative because there would have been technical colleges or polytechnics or art colleges. Surprise, surprise, what happened to them? They were all offered university status. This is how they were offered the university status. You become a university or we shut you down. That was the approach that was taken. And this means that the curriculum is not a reflection of the function of the industry, the practice of the industry, or the needs of the industry. It's a reflection of all the things that suit universities, which now are required by law all around the world to be competitive businesses. And their business is as they will describe it to you, bums on seats. And I've heard that so many times. I began saying to people, our job is to deal with the other end of the student,
right?
Not
yeah.
the asshole, but the bit at the top. I mean, that should never be part of anybody's strategy, but that's exactly how it's prioritized. So because everybody wants to be a character animator, everybody wants to be a screenwriter, everybody wants to be this, you've got a lot of the creative skills. Then because of the digital revolution in the 1990s, people who want to be programmers or on the technical side, that's okay also. You want to be a production coordinator, a contract lawyer, a producer? Is there any curriculum for that? No.
Yeah, it's not really designed for it.
There just aren't the curricula for it. There are in a very few places where they mean business. So in some of the colleges in Germany, France, it's not that nobody is teaching this, it's just incredibly rare. And the reason that this is important in an area like Latin America, where I'm currently living and working in Guadalajara in Mexico, there's a very real temptation for countries that are trying to create an industry to say, oh, well, our selling point is that you don't have to pay us as much as you pay everybody else. We will work more cheaply. But if the reason people are coming to you for work is that you're inexpensive, then by perfectly straightforward logic, if somebody offers the work for less, they'll leave. So you want to build the relationship on the strength of the quality of the work that you produce. So you need that to be at a global standard, but you also need it to be a good working relationship between the people who are bringing the work to you and your creation of the work and sending off the finished files. The great big difficulty is that you have a kind of double standard because you've got this idea of creating a service industry, and that means people never actually questioning the contracts they're signing. And what I keep saying to people is there's a reason in a legal document, in a contract, why there are numbered clauses, specifically so your legal representative can take that clause and question it or ask for it to be removed from the contract. You don't just have a contract pushed across the table to you, and because of the size or the importance or the fame of the company whose name is at the top of the contract, you just go, oh, I'll sign it, because it's...
I feel like people are pressured to do that, though.
Yeah, well, they shouldn't, because that's a total misunderstanding of what a contract is there to do. A contract is an agreement between two parties. It's not the person saying either sign this or we'll get somebody else to do the job. But that's very often the difficulty, is that people, as they're starting off, don't know what they don't know. And what I'm always saying to people is, it's perfectly okay not to know, but it's not okay not to ask. But people don't ask because they don't want to look foolish or they don't want to look inexperienced. And going back to this question about whether the creative or the way I describe it is it's like a tripod. If you actually want your industry or your business or your studio to be self-supporting, it needs all three legs. You need the creative leg, the technical leg, and the financial, legal, and organizational leg, or it will topple.
Yeah.
And if we're trying to encourage people not just to go out and be creative, but to be successful, you have this other mindset when it comes to money. And this is what's so important about layout, because one of the most pivotal quotes in the book comes from Ken O'Connor via Bill Perkins. So I interviewed Bill Perkins, who was the art director on Aladdin, and Ken O'Connor had been one of his mentors. And to this day, Bill has a post-it note with a quote from Ken on his desk that layout holds the purse strings to the production.
Right.
And what we do all over Europe and all through the UK, and people go to all these events, you hear people saying, how can I get the money to make my animated film or make my animated series? You never hear those people saying, once this is made, how is this going to generate income so that I don't have to keep going back with a begging bowl to the same arts funding agencies or lottery grants or whatever? We are all supposed to be creating content that will generate revenue. And that is heresy for a lot of people.
Yeah.
Because it's no, I want to be an artist, I want to be creative.
Kind of thinking, oh, well, that's someone else's problem. That's the executive producer's problem and I don't have to worry about it. But also this kind of entitlement. Yeah, I totally agree. That's what I've experienced as well.
There's a tendency for people to be very dismissive about the people that the two most common English terms are the people who are the suits or the bean counters. And of course, these are people who have no soul and no understanding of the suffering. Yesterday, for a whole 90 minutes, Alison Abati, who is the vice president, executive president of the Warner Animation Group, who was my boss on Space Jam, who was the artistic coordinator on Nightmare Before Christmas, she was saying producers are creative people too.
Yeah.
And
yeah.
there's the dividing off into opposing camps, the kind of divide and rule ancient idea was that, oh, you have all these artistic people who need to be cosseted and protected, and that was very much the culture in some of the studios that I worked in, was that particularly with the character animators, our job in production management, and when I was working in production management as an artistic coordinator on Tarzan, a lot of the people didn't know that I was also an artist, that I could draw.
Right.
And if they saw examples of my artwork, it'd be like, well, why are you working in production management? And some of the kids that were coming in from college directly into creative roles were basically treating me like a waiter. It was like, boy, come over here. And I'm like, excuse me?
Yeah.
Like, okay, so there's a lot of money in the industry at the moment and you just floated out of CalArts into a very nice position, but you don't talk to anybody in that way, and you don't treat the people, if the producers and the executives don't create the business environment in which we can work, we don't have work.
Yeah.
So the whole idea that, oh, well, we're the ones, the films are dependent on our brilliance and our skill. Bullshit. The films are dependent. It's like you go into the concert hall, you want to hear a performance of Beethoven's Ninth. First of all, you need Beethoven.
Yeah.
Second of all, you need the conductor. Then you need a 65-piece orchestra of people who have been rehearsing their skills since the age of 5. And then it's going to sound like Beethoven, but you can't have somebody stand up in the second violins and go, that was all me, that was.
Yeah.
But that's the way that we are imagining this, and it's the way we are presenting it to young people, is go into this industry and become successful, and people will just spend the whole day telling you how wonderful they are, just the way your followers tell you how wonderful you are on Instagram, and that just doesn't happen. It's a job.
There's like a lack of respect on either side. It's like I can think of maybe the suits, or the business people might see the creatives as kind of impractical kind of hippies who have their head in the clouds, and on the other side it could be like, all they care about is money. They have no sense of imagination. There's no creativity, and that's probably what the creatives think of the business people. But really, I think every person needs a balance. If you go too far in either direction, you'll be really left really unbalanced, to where you can't actually, if you're creative and you're too creative, you'll never get anything produced that's of significance. And on the other side, you won't be creative enough to.
And of course, when the computer revolution happened, really had its full impact in the 1990s, you had this third group of predominantly, at the time, thank God it's changing now, but it was a very male, very incommunicative, very distant. There were a lot of people. So you would have, if you like, at the end of the 90s, in a London Soho pub on a Friday night, if you had an animation studio nearby, you'd have the artists at one end of the bar, and they'd be making rude comments about the suits and the bean counters and how they didn't care and they just looked at the numbers. If you passed the management people, they would be giving this description of the artists as being these, irresponsible stoners who couldn't meet a deadline and come out of their bedroom till lunchtime. And then both of those groups, you'd see the guys that were programming geniuses with the check shirt and the jeans in the corner, and they would just be looking at them going, geeks. And it was a very, very unhealthy, dysfunctional, antagonistic context. But the other thing about the computer revolution that had such an impact on the universities, I left Scotland in 1985, and to the best of my knowledge, there was one animation course in any higher education institution in Scotland when I left. When I got back 15 years later, you were hard-pressed to find a single college or university that wasn't teaching animation. But they weren't teaching animation at all. All they had done was realize that packages like Maya suddenly made it possible for them to say, oh, this is the whole industry in a box.
Yeah.
And the people that produce the software are not going to say, well, yeah, I was on the road selling Animo, which was the Cambridge Animation Systems software that is now, the source code is still somewhere buried inside Toon Boom Harmony. And I went to all the big trade shows in Las Vegas and to SIGGRAPH and to NAB and all this stuff, and people would repeatedly come up to the stand and say, if we buy your product, does that mean that our little design business becomes an animation studio? And I said, if you buy a word processor, does that make you Shakespeare?
Yeah.
If you buy a piano, does that make you... No. But of course, it's a sales thing. So this awful satanic relationship between higher education wanting to get large numbers of people in and spit large numbers of people out with no concern for what happens to them after they graduate. Then you've got these people selling software who are like, yeah, go ahead. So all of the education costs for software packages and hardware, an educational establishment does not pay the same that a commercial studio does for a license for anything from Photoshop to you name it. There's an educational discount.
Yeah.
So you then get into this very difficult problem of you can't really get students working on, it's hard technically and legally to get students working on live projects because it's seen as a way for the companies to get the students to work on the university licenses and the university equipment, and they get all their work done at a knockdown rate. So when you try and close the gap between students and the industry itself, there are all kinds of complications because the software and the education industries are built on a competitive business model that doesn't actually care that much about the industry that it's supposed to be serving, because it's not the same goal. It's an individual selfish goal about how does my company make the most money, as opposed to how do we produce the best quality animation across all the different areas where animation is necessary. And animation is necessary now in a lot of things that have nothing to do with the entertainment industry. So
with the software company, like, they're incentivized to answer in a certain way. So the student will, a beginner student will ask, will this software allow me to create stunning animations, that are visually amazing? And if you're the software company answering that, you're financially incentivized to just say yes. Like, the software is the be all end all, that's all you need. And the more honest answer is that it's a tool that can be used to make good animations or very lackluster animations.
And in fairness, most of the people that I know, and I'm friends with a lot of people that work in the software industry. So again, they're not bad people either. It's just that the way our expectations of what people are going to encourage us to do or what people are going to say, you just have to be sensible about what the actual pressure is on the person to whom you're talking. And I was often in very awkward situations when I was part of the training and sales team at Cambridge Animation Systems, because you have several different kinds of pressure on you, because obviously the cost of developing a system, you need to pay back your investors, so you need to sell. But my angle always was, I am only going to go out there publicly and represent and teach what the software is currently capable of. Because in the 90s in particular, there was a great tendency for people to go, well, we're working on this functionality, so you can tell people. I said, I'm going to tell them about it when it's ready. You guys get it ready, I'll go out and sell it. But I'm not going to go out there and say, well, if you buy it now, in 6 months, this won't be a problem. It's only once you can tell that it won't be a problem that I'm going to go out and say it. And that's, everybody is under different kinds of pressure. Disney employees are under pressure, students are under pressure. It's just, we need always to be aware of what other people are influenced by. And most of us at some level are influenced by fear. We're worried that we're going to get caught out. We're worried that we're not going to be successful. We're worried that people aren't going to like our work. It's much easier to achieve a good quality end product if fear is not everybody's central motivation. And I find that there's a big mental health problem in education. And I raised this at an educators forum at CTN a couple of years ago, that I see too many members of staff. I actually asked a room full of people to put their hands in the air if, working in the field of education training in higher education, they or anybody that they knew was on medication for work-related stress, depression, or anxiety. And an alarming number of people had their hands in the air.
It's a massive
And I said,
epidemic.
okay, be serious. Do you have students who are also taking medication for work-related stress, anxiety, and depression? And I'm like, why are we doing this? What is everybody afraid of? If it's just a case of trying to achieve excellence this should not be an element in it. This should not be a component. You know, life itself presents enough anxieties and uncertainties that you don't need any additional incentive to be depressed or anxious or whatever. But we fall in love with the institutions that we create. And unless there are some really big shifts in thinking about the higher education institution itself and the commercial competitive model, I think we are going to continue to see these problems, but we don't have to. Yeah. We are free agents. We are in a position where if we all agree that this is not working, we can change it. We can do it differently.
Yeah, when it gets to a certain level, you have to, like, at a certain amount of people who admit to that, you have to say, this is systemic. It can't just be these random anomalies. There are too many people who feel this way, and it must be a result of the way it's structured at some level.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, I have been in situations where I was being told what the parameters were within which I could teach animation by sheep farmers. Because one of the universities that I worked for, the history of the computer arts department was that the first people on the campus who had ever bought and used computers were in the Department of Land Management, and that had simply never changed. Wow. So I had all these people whose area of expertise was agriculture and, you know, export of crops and whatever, and I was having to share facilities, but I was largely being hampered in how I could structure and present the teaching by people who were farmers. And I'm like, does nobody else think this is a bit odd? Like, how come I am having to ask, would you as a farmer spend 5 minutes listening to the advice that you got from somebody who is an animator? I mean, do me a favor.
I was just going to ask you actually, because I wanted to touch on, you said you have taught in many different countries, including the UK, Lebanon, I think.
Lebanon was interesting. I was invited over for I was only there for a week. It was a British Council incentive, and that was in 2005. And that was truly a remarkable week because, again, here's a country where a lot of the people running the course and, you know, the students taking the course, there was the backdrop of this terrible, what seemed like it was going to be never-ending civil war. And yet the level of enthusiasm and dedication to the, you know, it was my first time visiting the Middle East, and it was a really extraordinary education in the importance of the creative industries, where you're in a context where the socio-political landscape is in any way uncertain or unstable or whatever, that for people to be able to construct and manage a creative sector that is really producing good work. You know, these things are eternally important. It's very easy to go to different parts of the world where you think, well, because of the general perception of the chaos or if you think of the troubles in Ireland, you know, you think of what it used to be like in Belfast in the 70s. And, you know, a big part of the transformation in any of these areas is what happens in the creative industries. And it's so often the case that people will talk about the triviality of animation. And if you look at the United States and the relationship with South America, recently I took part in the Pixelatl online festival here, and we interviewed Ted Thomas, who's Frank Thomas's son, and he directed Walt and El Grupo, which is the documentary about all of the animators who went down to South America as part of what was later revealed to be the Good Neighbor program. So the Three Caballeros and Saludos Amigos. The reason the United States government wanted Disney and his artists to be in South America was there was a very real danger that the administrations and governments in South and Latin America were going to side with the Nazis. Wow. Because the Germans had been making a lot of investment in the area. So at a time where they were trying to make sure that the balance didn't go in the wrong direction, in a time of war, they didn't send troops down, they sent animators down.
I mean, Walt Disney had a huge role in the ideological war. I mean, wars are fought on many fronts, like economically and of course with boots on the ground soldiers, but also in the ideology and the solidarity of the people. And I think Walt Disney is perhaps underplayed as like his role during that time with the propaganda campaigns. I know the word propaganda carries with it a certain stigma, but propaganda is really needed during the war. I think it was really needed to pull everyone together under the same banner.
I think that there is an argument which says that anybody who's a storyteller is a propagandist, because the decision to tell this story as opposed to that story is already an editorial choice.
Yeah.
So, and there's an interesting, just to finish about your question about Lebanon, I met so many extraordinarily talented students. And again, I was only there for a week, but I kept in touch afterwards, particularly with two twin brothers, the Kobani brothers, who are part of this collective called Ashikman, which is graffiti and music. They have like a rap crew, clothing line or whatever. And if you go on the internet, one of their projects was to take green paint and go across all the roofs in a particular neighborhood of Beirut and paint in Arabic the word peace.
Oh, wow.
So that when people came in over the rooftops of Beirut on an airplane, the first thing they would see was peace painted across the top of it. And this is, for me, there was a great nervousness about the people that the British Council were sending in 2005, because after the agreements were signed for us to go out there, 10 of us were supposed to be getting on a plane and going out for the week. Only 2 of us showed up because Rafiq Hariri, who was the former billionaire prime minister, was assassinated in a car bomb explosion, and it wasn't thought to be safe. But, you know, I lived in London all through the IRA bombings, and there were bombs that went off out. There was a bomb that went off outside Canary Wharf the night before I went to America to work on Space Jam. And I thought, well, if I allow my anxiety to say, oh, don't get on the plane, don't go to the Middle East, I will miss my first ever opportunity to meet with artists and animators and young people there. And I was in touch with the Ashekman guys not so long ago, and it's terrible to see the big explosion in Beirut in the port. But around that same time, I was also teaching in Austria. So I went backwards and forwards to the Fachhochschule in Salzburg between 2003 and 2008. And that was also very, very inspiring and very interesting and very educational and very different. It wasn't like teaching in Scotland. It wasn't like teaching in other places.
Did you find that the times and the politics, did you see, or current events, did you see them reflected in the artwork that you saw there?
One of the most interesting things, and again, this will sound like I'm inventing it. I promise I'm not. When you go to Salzburg, a very considerable percentage of the tourist money that pours into Salzburg is because of The Sound of Music, which is a film all about the Anschluss.
Yeah.
And one of the things when I went there in 2003 that I was very nervous about, one of my 2 sisters-in-law was born in Hamburg, and her father was in the Luftwaffe when my father was in the Royal Air Force in World War II. And you have the Basil Fawlty thing about going to Germany or going to Austria and don't mention the war and all this kind of thing. But one of the things that was really noticeable was just how many of the students I was working with wanted to talk about the war, because obviously you are raised in Austria and in Germany with the idea that we must never repeat this. So we must make sure that the children grow up feeling that there is something they need to be aware of. But part of that education also left them with the completely mistaken impression that the Germans and the Austrians invented anti-Semitism. No, they didn't. England and the United States and Scotland.
Even Churchill was an anti-Semite, and a lot of people want to forget that.
In the 1970s, the people who had been my parents' next door neighbours in Glasgow, he was a member of a golf club that wouldn't allow Jewish, Catholic or whatever membership. So this level of false information about history, which really impacts on people. And, you know, the conversations that we had started very often with the students saying, we see all of this paraphernalia around Salzburg and all these tourists coming. What is it about The Sound of Music? Is it a good film?
Wow,
and I was like,
didn't know.
You've never seen it? But if you listen to the commentary by Robert Wise, the director, when they were filming the actual scenes of the Anschluss in Salzburg, there is a law that prohibits the display of the swastika in Germany and Austria for obvious reasons. And they were told by the city fathers that they couldn't display it. And they said, well, our alternative is to use the real news footage of Hitler's arrival, because he was welcomed with open arms. And these things seemed, when I was teaching between 2003 and 2008, as though the problems of fascism were historical problems. Mm-hmm. And of course, we've just seen the storming of the US Capitol by an angry mob. And we are living through another era of fascist ideology. And people are sort of going, as though this is somehow like an aberration. But this is where storytelling matters. And there are so many cases where there's an inclination for people to say, well, entertainment is trivial. We only have theatre and drama, going back to Greece and Rome, or the birth of puppetry in ancient Egypt. Puppets, the oldest puppets that we know of, were created to speak to the kings. Yeah. So to speak truth to power, you have to do it through a caricature or a cartoon or a puppet or an actor dressed up in order to let these important realities surface. And it's so easy for people to think of what happens in theatre or cinema or whatever as being, it's just decorative. And I really don't agree.
Yeah, I think someone once said history is always relevant.
And what you have now in the gaming sector with all of the virtual reality headsets and all of the fantastic new technology there, again, people are sort of looking at that from the point of view of first-person shooters or whatever. But step back, and what you see is these technologies being used by surgeons. So some of the most complex operations to separate conjoined twins, the surgeon can now put on a virtual reality headset and she can rehearse the operation before the patients are anesthetized and on the table. And this is true in cancer surgery. It's true in, you take the information out of an MRI scanner and you feed the data into exactly the same software that's being used to make animated feature films. And what you find is that this is reducing the mortality rate for surgery. The animation technology is being used in urban planning, deep space exploration, climate modeling. I have had people actually talking to me and saying, while I'm talking to them, they'll be on the mobile phone and they'll be saying, okay, so what do animators do? And I'm like, all that stuff that you were swiping around with your finger, who do you think is making that move?
Yeah, it's a user interface. It's designed. People who disrespect animation and design, visual careers, creative careers, they are people just like everyone else, because everyone else in the world is affected by these things that are created by people who are trained either visually or in creative technologies. And it's like these parents who might be concerned that their child is, wasting their time learning Unity or something.
You'll never make a living.
They're the same people that go downstairs after a hard day's work and watch Netflix. In their workplace, if they're working in the sciences, they'll watch a visualization created by an animator for what they're working towards, and it's a way to visualize it.
Absolutely.
There are so many different applications for it.
There are, and we are interacting with moving image content 24 hours a day. Not always by choice. But most people now, the last thing they do before they put the light off and go to sleep is check their feed on their mobile phone. Yeah. And it's the first thing they do before they even get out of bed and brush their teeth in the morning, is to roll over, because it's a portable device.
It's with them everywhere.
Yeah, exactly. That has an impact. And the way that we share or discuss or frame our reactions to our own circumstances or our own lives or our own political situation or whatever, these things are important. And it's if people believe that what's happening on Netflix, it has no political relevance, they simply haven't read and understood the history. The mass media, whether it's television or radio or through the internet or print, or you look at the gigantic change that there was with the invention of the movable type printing press. And at that time, the big deal was making the Bible available.
Yeah.
But the Bible was only to be made available in Latin.
Yeah.
And the people who dared to try and translate the Latin edition of the Bible into German or English or Spanish were hunted down and tortured and killed.
Yeah.
And that gives you a pretty clear indication of the power of the narrative, the person who controls the story.
And that was because the powers were afraid of information and education becoming democratized, because they held the power of the church. They had the power to basically tell people exactly what they wanted them to know, and nothing more or less than that.
Completely, and also, again, this is not a matter of my pinko lefty, fag subversive left, all the Kenny Everett stuff. It's not a question of opinion. The church kept detailed records of what they did to these people. It's not like they were doing it behind closed doors and hoping they would get away with it. They were the law.
Yeah.
So they were deciding that was what they were going to do. So if we look to the idea of the power of the storyteller, I also had, in setting the scene, the book that I did about layout, I was interviewing Ralph Eggleston, who was the director of For the Birds and the Academy Award-winning Pixar short with the little blue birds on the telephone line. And he gave me the opportunity to use his quote in my classes, but I was already saying this to students in another forum, but obviously they'll listen to it if it comes from Ralph, because he's an Academy Award-winning guy. But he was saying that in some cases when he was teaching, he would have students say, oh, I don't like Hitchcock films because they're manipulative, or I don't like Spielberg because he's a manipulative director. And Ralph's like, that's what you're paid to do.
Yeah.
If you don't want to manipulate people, go do something else, because it is your job.
Directors are professional manipulators.
And we are kidding ourselves. We are lying to ourselves if we think that we are somehow, oh no, I'm an objective filmmaker. No, you're not. If you want to stand up and influence people emotionally, you're a manipulative little son of a bitch like everybody else. But the responsibility is to motivate people not to go out and be violent and destructive, but to motivate people to go out and actually assert their values in what they do. It's why we tell stories to children.
Essentially what I wrote my thesis on was objectivity in film, and, well, more accurately, how objectivity is a myth in film. If you want to make an objective film, well, okay, you've got to turn the camera on. You've got to decide when to turn the camera on and at what angle the camera is on. Automatically, straight away from the get-go, that you're making decisions of what to show and what not to show. And yes, it is used in law, it is used in the court of law, but that doesn't stop it from being persuasive.
And it carries a responsibility with it. It's one of the reasons that I think, and again, it was great yesterday to have the opportunity to get Alison Abati to be talking to all of these young animators and movie makers, not just here in Latin America, but in Norway and Spain, all these different places. She was the producer on Iron Giant, and for me, the original Ted Hughes story, the adaptation that Brad Bird did, moving the story to the Red Scare America of the 1950s and Sputnik, was extremely clever. And I think Brad Bird is one of the most, he's one of my favorite writer-directors, because for me, the kind of most important moments in Iron Giant are souls don't die, and you are who you choose to be, and that this creature begins to realize that it's been designed to be a weapon, and it gets to choose instead to be the savior of the day. And the boy has that influence. And there's this tiny little reference in the middle of the film to the fact that his father was a fighter pilot who died. There's a little photograph by Hogarth's bed. It's the only time the father is never mentioned. His mother is raising him on her own. But the same is true in pretty much everything that Brad Bird has directed and brought to the screen. He doesn't waste the opportunity and the responsibility that he is given as a writer to create content that will support people in making the better decisions. In the Tomorrowland thing, it's like which wolf you feed and all this stuff. And it's not even necessarily originally Brad Bird's own philosophy, but it was certainly why Charles Dickens wrote books.
Yeah.
It's certainly why, and that was one of the first movies I worked on in London immediately before Roger Rabbit. Was an adaptation of Little Dorrit, which was all about his father's experience of being in debtor's prison. So I feel that what animation is being painted up as, or how it's being presented in a lot of contexts at the moment, is really missing the point. I think a lot of the questions that again, going back to this mental health question, I now have students who will go straight to asking me a question about how they can increase their online profile, how they can manage the number of likes.
Yeah.
And they're worried about what these thousands of total strangers who know precisely nothing about the animation or arts industries, they will very often start repeating the kind of work. They get into a comfort zone with their work because so many total strangers are telling them, "Oh, that's wonderful. I love the way you render the eyes," or "I love the way you make the hair look."
Yeah.
And I'm like, that's not going to get you. You're going to have this kind of fame and attention for a short time span, and then people will move on, and you won't know what to do next.
Well, a lot of it is vanity metrics. It's these numbers that actually they're not indicating the right kind of thing.
Yeah.
And there's also a thing like depth. I treat comments with a lot more. I care a lot more about someone who's been compelled to leave a comment on my video, because it requires it's a bigger hurdle. You've got to actually take the time to think of something and then type it down and then send it. And that's got a lot more weight behind it. And of course you can actually read what they have to say. And I care more about that than a like, especially on a platform like Instagram, where it's it can all be done with one thumb. You scroll and you tap twice and you to like it. That means absolutely nothing.
Yeah. And
you shouldn't chase it.
Yeah, and it's a very distorting lens, or a distorting mirror, or whatever, to see things through. And it's often people's first experience of praise of that kind. And the reality when you're working on a project is, for the project to work properly, you want people all day long to be reaffirming one another's the quality of the work and to be supporting one another. But nobody has got time to go around all day, every day, telling you you're wonderful. It just doesn't happen. And we've got this kind of, it's almost like a kind of eternally sucking your thumb for comfort. the way that these loops and closed loops build up. And if you watch the Social Dilemma documentary, which is really focuses on all the algorithms that create these cycles, where animation fits into all of that at the moment is crucially important, because the way in which we are receiving our animated content, whether it's in the form of video games or feature films or virtual reality experiences, nobody is going to all the trouble and expense of creating that content without the hope that they will influence the audience in some particular way. Yeah. But if the only influence is towards a financial transaction, then we're not doing our job as storytellers.
Well, I think the other incentive people have is the furthest they go in the aim that they have for people is to get the audience to like them. It's I really want you to like me. And that's a very shallow thing to desire.
It's completely shallow. And if you go to, one of the things, I remember having a conversation with one of the guys that I was working with on Tarzan, and saying that, the fact that up until the 1990s, until Prince of Egypt was made by DreamWorks and Space Jam was made by Warner Brothers, yes, there had been people like the Fleischer brothers and Don Bluth who had, dared to make some animated feature-length films. But really, Disney had a complete monopoly until the 1990s of feature film animation that actually traveled the world and succeeded and made its money back in sufficient amounts. Then suddenly it was going from a new Disney film coming out every few years to having these a year-round avalanche of CG animated features.
Yeah.
And I was comparing the original Disney features from Snow White and Bambi and Fantasia through to the films of the Xerox era with Robin Hood and Jungle Book, but particularly the early ones like Bambi as being the cathedrals of the 20th century, because it was the only collective effort that required so many different scientific, artistic and creative skills. But if you go into Notre Dame, since it's been renovated after the roof fire, nobody knows the names of the people that did the carvings or made the drawings or did the stained glass windows. But hundreds of years later, you are still moved by it.
Yeah.
And for most people in the general public, the only name they know associated with Bambi is Disney.
Yeah.
They don't know the individual names of any of the layout artists, background painters, special effects animators, and they don't know and they don't care.
Hopefully they understand that it's a collective of people that's not Disney didn't sit down to draw Bambi.
But they're not required to.
Yeah.
It's not part of the mechanism. And so if you are coming into the industry in the hope that you will spend your entire life with people telling you how wonderful you are, you're probably coming into it, first of all, for the wrong reasons, and second of all, heading for a series of disappointments your whole life long, because nobody knows or cares who we are. They care about what winds up on the screen. It's not our job to be famous in the middle of all that. And if it's like, oh, I want to be a famous concept artist or I want to be a famous character animator, if that's your motivation, think again, because it's going to influence the work environment, because if everybody else has got to treat you with kid gloves because you're this person, it's like, well, what do you know, because there's 15,000 people yesterday that liked this on Instagram. It's like, well, I don't like it and I'm your director, so tough. Anyway,
well, I think fame is good for one's career, so if you're able to reach out and get it, it will help, because people can't hire you if they don't know you. So that doesn't mean like mainstream fame, but fame within a certain group of people, or being known within a certain group of people, can open doors. But at the same time, I think it's the human condition to want to be liked and known by people, and to make that kind of impact. But you have to kind of, in that way, you can't outsource that. That has to be something internal that within you, where you have enough respect for yourself and like for yourself and enough confidence to say, without anyone else knowing, yeah, I'm doing a good job with this, and to give yourself pats on the back instead of and that's very frowned upon among animators, to give yourself a pat on the back. For whatever reason, people, it's like, oh no, you have to be humble. But internally, I mean, if you aren't doing that internally, externally, you're going to have to look for it externally, and then you're giving the power over to other people. Recognition, I just see it as a practical means to more work, you know?
Yeah, but it can work against you also, because the whole, like, this is what is so insidious about the idea of cool, because cool as a mechanism works on a principle of exclusion. It's like, we're cool, they're not. This is cool, that isn't. This is cool this week, next week nobody will care about it. So cool is always, there's something really nauseating to me about the idea of, oh, cool, because it's like kids in the playground not talking to those kids over there because they're not cool. And it's bullshit. But it's an extremely powerful and seductive idea, that because to be cool is amazing for the moments that it lasts.
It's fine.
And then afterwards, during the period that I was a student, there were people in the same general, in the years either side of me, who did become famous. And I can't say that it ended well for everybody, because with the fame, for some people, there were issues of addiction, depression, all that kind of stuff. It looks like something worth chasing, and it's usually more trouble than it's worth. I think the kind of recognition where people who are in your field know your name, because you've got a reputation as being someone who is capable and nice to work with. The simplest way to put it is, you can be the most amazingly talented person in terms of technique, but if you treat the people around you badly, you won't get work. Whereas if you are, competent, but a really dependable, nice person, you will get work all the time, because these projects are completed under tremendous pressure, often in circumstances where you have to be doing long hours, which I also object to. I think that this is one of the reasons to be teaching people resource management and time management and people management, so that people are not doing 18-hour days and committing suicide, like that young man that was working at the mill in Vancouver with a story in Cartoon Brew about he came from New Zealand and, you know, had made 2 suicide attempts, and there was a $35,000 penalty clause in his contract that if he quit or finished before the movie was done, he would owe them $35,000.
Oh, goodness.
That kind of pressure for people to be, nobody wants a bad reputation, but if you're chasing a kind of reputational thing that people are like, oh my God, that person's just so amazing. It's like,
chasing it is a different thing.
It's not, for those people who are at that level, often that level of notoriety is burdensome. It's not helpful.
Yeah, maybe it reaches a certain point where it stops becoming useful and starts becoming a problem.
It reaches that point very, very quickly on the internet. Because I give you an example. We were doing these sketching sessions, both where I was in Norway, but even on a bigger scale here in Guadalajara, where every month we would have a Saturday where we would have live musicians, circus performers, people would come and draw, make puppets, whatever. We'd all go to this big cafe. And some people who were doing a lot of comic book work, they brought this, she only ever came along to one event. And I'd take photographs as the kind of host of the event to post on Facebook to let people see all the amazing creative work that's being done. And it's great fun, it's really cool. And we haven't been able to do it since the shutdown. And I hadn't met this young artist before, and I was saying, do you mind if I take some pictures? And, if you want to connect on Facebook, you'll see them later on the post. And she said, well, I'd rather you contacted me through my fan page. And I was like, pardon? Like, this is somebody who was like 24, 25, and it's like, it'd be more convenient for me if you contacted me through my fan page. Like, fan page? Like, okay, well, that's put me in my place, but she's going to have problems if that's the way that her attitude develops in the commercial sphere, whether she's doing illustration or animation or whatever.
She probably didn't realize who she was talking to with that, I think.
She was just talking to some bald Scots guy. I mean, and this is the thing also that I find it peculiar. People talk of me the way that I get described sometimes in the blurb for a festival or an event. I just think, Jesus, go check the IMDb page. I mean, look at where I actually am in the credits on these movies. I am plankton in the general ecosystem of the animation and movie business. But again, it's simply because people have such favorable recollections and associations with Roger Rabbit or Space Jam or whatever. And I keep reminding people, I had the good fortune to work on some projects that everybody knows and likes and recognizes. But man, have I worked on some shit as well. And and that's how I've paid the rent a lot of the time. And occasionally it's great. It's nice to ride the wave when things are going well. But you can't have that as your expectation of that's going to be the full fabric of what you're doing. It's always patchy.
I guess it's good that you worked on really well-known things like Roger Rabbit, Space Jam, Tarzan. You keep that forever. Like, you can say that forevermore that you worked on them, and so like it's a really big asset, it seems, to have worked on something that's high profile and to be able to attach your name to it.
What would be, if I could be really cynical about this, do you know what would be an even bigger asset?
What?
Is if I got any fucking residual payments from any of it. Because that stuff is still out there making money. And this is another point that I try and get people to understand, is about unionization. Because a lot of people, particularly at the moment in Latin America, are saying we have to unionize. Okay, well, be careful. Because the ACTT was the union at the time that I was trying to get into the industry in 1983 when I left college. And they had such a powerful stranglehold on the industry that in Scotland, which had 5 million people at the time that I graduated, the ACTT, as the controlling union for cinema and television, would only allow 3 new people into the industry every year. 3.
What?
And all of them in technical grades, none of them in the creative grades. Yeah, the only official union doorway, it was a closed shop, and they controlled everything. So if you tried to take work without having a union card, they could shut the production down. So there was a scheme called the Scottish Film Training Trust, which was sanctioned by the ACTT, but it was still twisted, because if I was in London and I got my ACTT card through a union-sanctioned training project, I was free to work anywhere in the United Kingdom. I got my ACTT card through the Scottish Film Training Trust in Glasgow. I then had to get special permission from the central office ACTT in Soho Square to accept the offer of a job in London, because London was a closed shop within a closed shop. So a lot of the problems in the 60s and 70s, this happened in my father's industry, which was journalism and publishing.
Yeah.
The Fleet Street print unions refused to adopt the computer typesetting technology. They didn't want all of the hot metal typesetters to be put out of business. And in this huge war that built up between the print unions and Rupert Murdoch won.
Yeah.
And the net result was, I'm very, very strongly in favor of trades unions. You need to protect people's health and safety. You need to protect their working hours, their rights, their conditions. But the problem is that inside of a union, the hierarchical structure of the union itself can also be corrupted and can also go to the dark side and create very, very difficult working conditions in a situation where it's supposed to be making the working conditions better. So I had to train to be a film editor because I couldn't train to be a production designer or an art director because there was no scheme sanctioned by the union at the time that allowed me to do that. And so I had spent all of those years at art college building up my visual skills and my design and artistry in all these different areas. And I just had to say, well, if I want to work in movies, I have to set that to one side because there was no way for me to do both things at once. And it was purely because the financial structures of the UK film industry collapsed in on themselves in the late 1980s when I finished work on my first feature film in London, which was Little Dorrit, that Disney were making Roger Rabbit, and I saw a job advertisement while I was looking for other cutting room work, and I didn't even send artwork to Disney when I saw the advert because I didn't think they would be interested because I didn't have any animation experience. And my tutors had spent 3 years telling me how shit they thought my drawing was because it was too traditional and too boring.
Can we talk about that? About the influence teachers can have, and whether my experience at university is the teachers would never acknowledge to a student's face when their work was really good. Or when they made something, when they did a good job on a project, they'd speak about it afterwards to other people, but they would never say so. And I think that's because they wanted the students to listen to them. If there's a cocky art student, they're not going to listen to what the teacher has to say. It meant no one had any self-esteem. No one actually believed they could do something like join Disney, even though really it's kind of out of your control. And sometimes Disney just really needs someone. They really need a compositor or something, and it's worth just sending it, right?
So this is a crucial question. I can't not have strong feelings about this. And again, I'm more inclined to use the word feelings than opinions because for me, this is all experience-based stuff. I haven't imagined or invented or whatever. I mean, I don't know, maybe I've embroidered it over time, but in 1979, when I went into the Glasgow School of Art to study, I thought I was going to be a painter because if you move a little further back in time, you know who Andreas Deja is? Yeah,
I love his work.
So Andreas Deja and myself, we're roughly the same age. And Andreas, the first time I met Andreas, he was one of the animators that came from Disney to London to work on Roger Rabbit, and on Friday nights when we'd be in the Edinburgh Castle pub in Camden, I sort of know Andreas a bit to say hello to, but he doesn't really know me from a crack in the pavement. But anyway, when Jungle Book was released, which was at the end of the 1960s, its release in Scotland, I would have been about 8 or 9 years old. And I remember going to see the film, and they sold more tickets than they had seats. It was packed.
Wow.
And I went home just thinking, oh my God, that was wonderful. At exactly the same time, when it was released in Germany for the first time, Andreas Deja and his parents were sitting watching it in a cinema in Germany. And Andreas went home and didn't just say, that was wonderful, can I save up and we'll go back and see it a second time? He wrote a letter to Disney and said, when I'm older, I want to work for you. What should I do?
Wow.
And Disney wrote back.
Oh,
and they wrote back and pretty much just said, draw. Keep drawing.
Full stop.
And let us know when you're older and we'll look at your drawings.
That's amazing. And then Andreas, he became a legend in animation.
Exactly. So it was a question of aspirational what you imagine is possible.